Los Angeles, November 1983. The Tonight Show studio was buzzing with anticipation. Johnny Carson was hosting one of his legendary Actors Roundtable episodes, featuring three of Hollywood's biggest stars, Michael Caine, Robert De Niro, and Harrison Ford. But sitting across from them was someone who made the actors visibly uncomfortable. Vincent Torres, the acclaimed director whose latest film Midnight in Moscow was dominating the awards conversation. Torres had requested to be on the show specifically to discuss his new film and what he called the crisis of authenticity in modern acting. He'd been making waves in recent interviews, criticizing actors who he claimed were more interested in fame than craft, more focused on paychecks than artistic truth. The problem with Hollywood today, Torres was saying, gesturing dramatically with his coffee mug, is that we've forgotten what real acting looks like. We've got pretty faces reading lines instead of artists creating truth. Carson, always the professional host, tried to keep things light. Well, Vincent, you've certainly assembled an impressive cast for your new film. How did you choose your actors? Torres smiled, but there was something cold about it. I choose actors who are willing to sacrifice for their art, who understand that comfort is the enemy of truth. My lead actor, James Morrison, lost 40 pounds for the role, lived in character for 6 months. That's commitment. Michael Caine shifted in his chair. He'd heard these kinds of speeches before from method directors who believed suffering was the only path to authentic performance. But there was something different about Torres, something that made Caine's instincts fire warning signals. That sounds incredibly demanding, Carson said. Michael, you've worked with a lot of different directors. What do you think makes a great director-actor relationship? Before Caine could answer, Torres interrupted. If I may, Johnny, I think that's exactly the wrong question. A director shouldn't be trying to make actors comfortable. A director should be pushing actors beyond their comfort zones, forcing them to find truth they didn't know they had. He turned to look directly at the three actors. Too many performers today want to be coddled, want to be told they're wonderful just for showing up. Real art requires real sacrifice. Robert De Niro, who was known for his own intense method approach, looked uncomfortable. Harrison Ford was studying his hands. But Caine was watching Torres carefully, reading something in the director's body language that the cameras weren't picking up. Vincent, Carson said, your film deals with some pretty heavy themes: political oppression, psychological torture. How do you help your actors prepare for such intense material? Torres leaned forward, his eyes lighting up. You don't help them prepare, you immerse them. You create an environment where they have no choice but to find the truth of the experience. Can you give us an example? Carson asked. Certainly. There's a scene in the film where Morrison's character is interrogated by secret police. Instead of just talking about it in rehearsal, we created a real interrogation scenario. I had my assistants wake him up at 3 a.m, drag him from his hotel room, and subject him to 6 hours of psychological pressure. The studio audience murmured uncertainly. This didn't sound like normal filmmaking. He didn't know it was coming. Torres continued proudly. His terror, his confusion, his desperation, all of it was real. That's what you see on screen. That's authentic performance. Caine felt his stomach tighten. What Torres was describing wasn't directing. It was abuse. He glanced at Carson, who looked genuinely disturbed but was trying to maintain his professional composure. That sounds intense, Carson said carefully. It's necessary, Torres insisted. Actors today are too comfortable, too safe. They need to be broken down before they can build something real. I've developed techniques over my 20-year career that push performers to places they never would have found on their own. The way he said techniques made Caine's blood run cold. There was pride in Torres's voice, ownership. He was bragging about psychologically manipulating actors, and he was doing it on national television. Vincent, Caine said quietly, can I ask you something? Torres turned to him with that same cold smile. Of course, Michael. How many actors have you worked with using these techniques? Dozens. Some of the finest performances in modern cinema have come from my methods. Caine nodded thoughtfully. And how many of those actors have worked with you again? The question hung in the air. Torres's smile faltered slightly. Well, great art requires sacrifice. Not everyone is cut out for. I'm not asking about sacrifice, Caine interrupted gently. I'm asking about repeat collaborations, Because in my experience, when actors have a good working relationship with a director, they want to work together again. Torres was getting defensive now. Some actors aren't ready for the level of commitment I require. They prefer easier projects. Or Caine said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge. They prefer directors who don't psychologically abuse them. The studio went dead silent. Carson looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. De Niro and Ford were staring at Caine with a mixture of admiration and terror. Torres's face flushed red. "I beg your pardon? You just described terrorizing an actor for 6 hours," Caine said matter-of-factly. "You dragged him from his hotel room in the middle of the night without his consent and subjected him to psychological torture. And you're proud of it. It's called method direction," Torres snapped. "It's about finding authentic truth. It's called abuse," Caine replied. "And the fact that you don't see the difference is deeply disturbing." The tension in the studio was palpable. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity chat show that audiences expected from The Tonight Show. This was something much more serious. Carson tried to intervene. "Perhaps we should move on to—" "No," Caine said, his voice firm but respectful. "I think this is important. Vincent, you mentioned that you've been developing these techniques for 20 years. Can you tell us about some of your other methods?" Torres was trapped. He could either refuse to answer and look defensive, or he could continue describing what were clearly abusive practices. "I create realistic scenarios," he said carefully. "I put actors in situations that mirror their characters' experiences." "Like what?" Caine pressed. "Well, for a war film I made in 1978, I had actors live in trenches for a week. No modern conveniences, minimal food, constant stress. Did they consent to this beforehand?" Torres hesitated. "They knew they were making a war film." "That's not what I asked. Did you tell them specifically that they would be deprived of food and forced to live in trenches?" "The details were worked out during production." Caine turned to look directly at the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Mr. Torres is describing is a pattern of psychological and physical abuse disguised as artistic method. No actor should ever be subjected to surprise torture, food deprivation, or psychological manipulation, regardless of the artistic justification." Torres shot to his feet. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Caine stood as well, his voice gaining power. "How dare I point out that your methods are abusive? How dare I suggest that actors deserve to be treated with basic human dignity?" The studio audience was completely silent, transfixed by this unexpected confrontation. "You're twisting my words," Torres said. "Everything I do is in service of the art." "No," Caine replied. "Everything you do is in service of your ego. You've convinced yourself that abuse equals authenticity, that trauma equals truth. But that's not directing, Vincent. That's sadism with a camera." Carson looked like he wanted to call for a commercial break, but he was as mesmerized as everyone else. "Let me tell you about real directing," Caine continued. "Real directors create an environment of trust where actors feel safe to take risks. They collaborate with performers to find truth together. They don't ambush them with psychological torture." He took a step closer to Torres. "I've worked with some of the greatest directors in cinema history. John Huston, Sidney Lumet, Brian De Palma. Not one of them ever had to traumatize actors to get great performances. Do you know why?" Torres didn't answer. "Because they understood that great acting comes from emotional truth, not from actual trauma. They knew how to help actors access their own experiences and emotions safely, without putting them in genuine danger." The passion in Caine's voice was building. "When I played Jack Carter in Get Carter, I didn't need the director to actually threaten my family to understand the character's motivation. When I played Frank in The Gambler, I didn't need to be thrown into actual debt. Good directors help actors find the emotional truth without inflicting the literal experience." Torres tried to interject, but Caine wasn't finished. "What you're describing, Vincent, isn't method directing. It's abuse of power. You're taking advantage of actors' desire to please, their fear of being labeled difficult, their commitment to their craft, and you're using those things to justify your own sadistic impulses." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. "You've created a system where actors feel they have to endure your abuse to prove their dedication to their craft. But that's not dedication. That's manipulation. You've made them complicit in their own mistreatment by convincing them it's for the greater good of the art. Carson finally found his voice. Perhaps we should take a commercial break. No, Caine said firmly. This needs to be said, because there are young actors watching this show who might think that what Vincent does is normal, that it's something they should accept. He looked directly into the camera again. If you're an actor and a director tells you that you need to be genuinely terrified, genuinely starved, genuinely traumatized for a role, that's not artistic commitment, that's abuse. You have the right to say no. You have the right to walk away. Torres' face was purple with rage. You're destroying my career with these accusations. I'm not making accusations, Caine replied calmly. I'm repeating what you just told millions of people on national television. You described terrorizing an actor for 6 hours. You described depriving actors of food. You described manipulating them without their informed consent. Those are your words, not mine. The truth of this hit Torres like a physical blow. He had been bragging about his methods, proud of his techniques. He hadn't realized how they sounded when stripped of artistic justification. You don't understand, Torres said desperately. The performances I get, the performances you get come from talented actors despite your methods, not because of them, Caine interrupted. You're taking credit for their talent while traumatizing them in the process. De Niro finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. Michael's right. I've worked with directors who push actors hard, but there's always consent, always safety measures. What you're describing, that's not professional. Harrison Ford nodded in agreement. I've done physically demanding roles, emotionally challenging scenes, but the director always made sure I knew what I was getting into. Always made sure there were limits, boundaries. Torres looked around the studio, realizing that he had lost the room completely. The audience, the other guests, even Carson, everyone was looking at him with disgust and concern. You've all gone soft, Torres said weakly. You've forgotten what real art requires. Real art requires respect, Caine said firmly. Respect for the craft, respect for the material, and respect for the people bringing it to life. What you're doing isn't real art, it's exploitation. The camera was still rolling, capturing every moment of Torres' public exposure. Millions of people were watching a celebrated director being systematically dismantled by one of Hollywood's most respected actors. Vincent, Carson said carefully, perhaps you'd like to clarify your comments. Explain your directing philosophy in a way that might address Michael's concerns. It was a lifeline, a chance for Torres to walk back his statements, to claim he'd been misunderstood or exaggerating for effect. But his ego wouldn't let him. My methods work, he said stubbornly. The proof is in the performances. The proof, Caine said quietly, is in the trauma you've inflicted. The proof is in the actors who won't work with you again. The proof is in the young performers whose careers you've damaged by convincing them that abuse is artistic. He paused, letting that sink in. How many actors have quit the business after working with you, Vincent? How many have sought therapy? How many have needed time to recover from the authentic experiences you put them through? Torres's silence was answer enough. Carson finally called for a commercial break, and when they returned, Torres's chair was empty. He had walked off the set during the break, unable to face any more questions about his methods. Well, Carson said with forced lightness, that was unexpected. Michael, I have to say, what you did took real courage. It wasn't courage, Caine replied. It was necessity. When you see abuse happening, especially when it's being celebrated and normalized, you have an obligation to speak up. The rest of the show was subdued, but the damage was done. Torres's career never recovered from that night. The industry, which had previously turned a blind eye to his methods, could no longer ignore what everyone had seen on television. Within weeks, 3 major studios canceled their deals with Torres. Actors began speaking out about their experiences working with him. The Screen Actors Guild launched an investigation into his practices. But the real victory wasn't Torres's downfall, it was the conversation that followed. Young actors began speaking up about abusive conditions on sets. Directors and producers started implementing clearer boundaries and safety protocols. The industry began to acknowledge that artistic excellence didn't require human suffering. Michael Caine had used his platform and his reputation to expose a predator hiding behind artistic pretension. In doing so, he had potentially saved countless actors from abuse and trauma. If you've ever encountered someone who uses their authority to justify harmful behavior, if you've ever been told that abuse is necessary for success, Michael Caine's exposure of Vincent Torres reminds us that speaking truth to power isn't just brave, it's essential. That real art comes from collaboration and respect, not from exploitation and trauma. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is say no to the normalization of abuse, even when, especially when, that abuse is dressed up as something noble or necessary. The aftermath of that November night in 1983 was swift and decisive. By the following morning, entertainment reporters were calling it the Tonight Show takedown and the night Hollywood changed. Video clips of the confrontation played on every major news program, with media analysts calling it a watershed moment for the industry. Within 48 hours, the Directors Guild of America announced they would be reviewing their ethical guidelines regarding director-actor relationships. The Screen Actors Guild established a hotline for actors to report abusive working conditions anonymously. Major studios began requiring clearer documentation of what actors could expect during intensive preparation periods. But perhaps more importantly, the incident gave permission to actors who had been suffering in silence to finally speak out. Over the following weeks, more than 24 performers came forward with stories about Torres's methods. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than what had been revealed on television. Jessica Palmer, who had starred in Torres's 1979 film Desert Storm, described being left alone in the desert for 12 hours without water as preparation for a survival scene. "He told me it was the only way to understand my character's desperation," she said in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter. "I ended up hospitalized for dehydration. When I complained, he said I wasn't committed enough to the art." Marcus Webb, a young actor from Torres's 1981 drama, The Breaking Point, revealed that the director had hired actors to pose as muggers and attack him on his way to set. "I thought I was going to die," Webb said. "When I found out it was staged, I was so traumatized I couldn't work for months." Torres said, "I should thank him for giving me authentic fear to draw from." The stories kept coming. Actors locked in rooms for hours, performers subjected to verbal abuse disguised as character development, young actresses pressured into uncomfortable situations under the guise of exploring their character's vulnerability. Each revelation made Caine's intervention look more crucial. He had exposed not just one incident of poor judgment, but a systematic pattern of abuse that had been hidden behind the veneer of artistic innovation. The industry's response was remarkable. Major casting directors began sharing blacklists of directors known for abusive practices. Talent agencies started including working conditions clauses in their clients' contracts. Film schools began teaching courses on professional boundaries and actor safety. Steven Spielberg, one of Hollywood's most respected directors, spoke publicly about the incident. "What Michael did that night took incredible courage. He could have stayed silent, let someone else handle it, protected his own career. Instead, he used his platform to protect other actors, especially young ones who might not have the power to protect themselves." The impact extended beyond Hollywood. Theater communities around the world began examining their own practices. Acting schools revised their curricula to include discussions about professional boundaries. The conversation about artistic authenticity versus human dignity became a global phenomenon. Torres himself disappeared from public view after the show. His publicist released a statement claiming he had been misunderstood and was seeking clarification about his methods. But no clarification ever came. He moved to Europe and largely stopped making films. His career effectively ended by 90 seconds of live television. For Michael Caine, the incident became a defining moment in his legacy. While he was already respected as an actor, he was now seen as someone willing to use his influence to protect others. Young actors began approaching him at industry events to thank him for speaking up. "You saved my career before it even started," one young actress told him at a 1984 awards ceremony. "I was about to audition for a Torres film because I thought I had to endure his methods to be taken seriously. After seeing what you said on Carson, I realized no role was worth that kind of abuse." The conversation also sparked broader discussions about power dynamics in Hollywood. Caine began speaking regularly about the responsibility that came with success and influence in the industry. "When you reach a certain level in this business," he said in a 1984 interview with Variety, "you have a choice. You can use your position to protect yourself, or you can use it to protect others. The industry has been protecting predators and abusers for too long by staying silent. Sometimes you have to risk your own comfort to ensure others' safety. The long-term effects of that night continued to ripple through Hollywood for years. The phrase Torres moment became industry shorthand for calling out abusive behavior. Directors known for pushing boundaries found themselves under increased scrutiny. The culture of silence that had protected abusive practices began to crack. In 1985, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences established the Professional Conduct Committee, designed to investigate reports of abusive behavior and maintain ethical standards in film production. The committee's first case involved a director who had been forcing actors to perform dangerous stunts without proper safety measures. By 1987, industry-wide protocols were in place requiring informed consent for any method techniques that might cause psychological or physical distress. Directors had to provide detailed explanations of their methods before filming began, and actors had the right to refuse any technique without career repercussions. The changes weren't just procedural, they were cultural. The idea that suffering was necessary for artistic authenticity was increasingly challenged. Directors like Sidney Lumet and Mike Nichols spoke publicly about creating supportive environments that allowed actors to explore difficult emotions safely. "Great acting comes from trust, not trauma," Lumet said in a 1986 interview. When actors feel safe, when they trust their director and their fellow performers, they can go to emotional places they never could under duress. Fear doesn't create authenticity, it creates self-protection. Caine himself continued to be vocal about these issues throughout his career. He became known for walking off sets where actors were being mistreated, regardless of the financial or professional consequences. His reputation for professional integrity became legendary in the industry. In 1989, he was honored by the Screen Actors Guild with a special recognition award for courage in protecting fellow performers. That night on Carson wasn't about destroying one man's career. It was about protecting countless others from abuse. It was about saying that artistic excellence and human dignity aren't mutually exclusive, that you can create great art without destroying the people who make it. He looked out at the audience of his peers. We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see abuse happening, not just for our own sake, but for the young actors coming up behind us who might not have the power or knowledge to protect themselves. Silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. The speech received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. But for Caine, the real measure of success wasn't the applause, it was the knowledge that the industry had changed, that future generations of actors would work in safer, more respectful environments. Years later, when the #Me Too movement brought renewed attention to abuse in Hollywood, many industry observers pointed back to Caine's confrontation with Torres as an early example of using celebrity platform to expose predatory behavior. His willingness to sacrifice his own comfort to protect others had set a precedent that influenced how the industry responded to later scandals. In interviews about the movement, Caine was characteristically modest about his role. "I just said what needed to be said." The real heroes are the actors who came forward with their stories, who were brave enough to break the silence. All I did was give them permission to speak. But those who witnessed that night in 1983 knew better. They had seen an established star risk his own reputation to protect vulnerable performers. They had watched someone use their platform not for self-promotion, but for protection of others. Vincent Torres died in obscurity in 2003, his name largely forgotten except as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power in creative industries. Michael Caine, meanwhile, continued to work well into his 80s, revered not just for his acting ability but for his character and integrity. The lesson of that November night remains relevant today, that speaking truth to power isn't just about individual courage, it's about collective responsibility. That those with influence have an obligation to protect those without it. And that sometimes the most important performance you can give isn't on screen, but in real life when you refuse to let abuse masquerade as art. If you've ever witnessed abuse being justified by authority, if you've ever seen someone's suffering dismissed as necessary for success, Michael Caine's exposure of Vincent Torres reminds us that silence isn't golden, it's complicit. That real courage means speaking up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky, even when it would be easier to look the other way. Because sometimes, just sometimes, Those 90 seconds of truth can change an entire industry forever.